So, um, if you're out in the wilderness, right, you're holding a standard compass.
Right, just trying to find your way.
Exactly. And you're using it to walk directly north. Well, you are actually being violently pulled south.
It's one of those wild foundational facts of physics.
Yeah, we all vaguely learn it in school, but we rarely stop to think about the mechanics of it.
Hmm.
Like to have your compass point to the top of the globe, the Earth's geographic North Pole has to operate as a magnetic South Pole.
It's totally counterintuitive. But
Uh,
today we are looking at the mechanics behind that invisible pole.
we really are. We are jumping into a fascinating source today. It's a translated sixth-grade science textbook from the Punjab Curriculum and Textbook Board in Lahore, Pakistan.
And the main focus here is applied electricity and magnetism.
Right. And, I mean, we all know the basics of this topic, but it is incredibly satisfying to see these foundational rules distilled so elegantly. Our mission for this deep dive is to just strip away all that complex jargon.
Yeah, to shortcut our way to understanding how the invisible forces of our universe actually operate.
Exactly. We're mapping the journey from ancient, mysterious rocks all the way to the volatile current surging through your walls right now. So, okay, let's unpack this. Where does human understanding of these forces actually begin?
Well, it begins with observing the natural world, specifically in a province called Magnesia, which is in modern-day Turkey.
Oh, wow. Magnesia. So that's where the name comes from.
Exactly. Long before a power grid ever existed, people discovered this dark, metallic-looking mineral that just naturally pulled iron toward it. They called it a lodestone.
A lodestone, right? Basically a naturally occurring permanent magnet.
Yeah. And what is really compelling about these natural magnets is their exclusivity. Like, magnetism is not a universal property of matter.
Highly specific.
Very. These stones primarily interact with iron, nickel, and cobalt, but they completely ignore materials like wood or glass or copper.
And that exclusivity kind of points to something structural happening beneath the surface, doesn't it?
It does. And we see that structure when we look at one of the main quirks of permanent magnets. They always have a north pole and a south pole.
Right. And I love this analogy. Breaking a magnet is like trying to cut a stick so it only has one end. I mean, it's impossible.
Yeah, you just get two smaller sticks with two new ends.
Exactly. If you take a standard bar magnet and snap it in half, you do not isolate a separate north pole and a separate south pole. You just get two smaller magnets, each with its own brand new opposite poles. Every single time you break it, it regenerates.
Which tells us that magnetism is not just a surface coating. It's an intrinsic property of the material's atomic architecture.
Okay, so what's happening inside?
Inside a piece of magnetic iron, the atoms group together into these microscopic neighborhoods. The text calls them domains.
Domains, okay.
Yeah, and you can visualize these domains as millions of tiny, independent compass needles. In an unmagnetized piece of iron, those needles are pointing in just random, chaotic directions.
So they just cancel each other out.
Exactly. Their individual fields cancel out.
Huh.
But in a permanent magnet, those millions of needles are rigidly aligned. They all point in the exact same direction.
So their tiny forces combine into one unified field. That makes sense.
Right, so when you snap the bar in half, you're simply exposing a new cross-section of those already aligned internal domains.
But wait, if snapping it just exposes the internal structure, is there actually a way to destroy a permanent magnet? Like, how do you strip away that invisible power?
Well, you have to disrupt that internal cooperation. You literally have to attack the material at the structural level.
How do you do that?
The textbook mentions two primary physical mechanisms: kinetic shock and extreme thermal energy.
Oh, so hitting it or heating it.
Exactly. If you violently strike a magnet or, repeatedly drop it onto a hard surface, you send physical shock waves through the material.
And that kinetic energy just physically jars those microscopic domains right out of their strict alignment.
Yeah. You are turning a highly disciplined, synchronized marching band back into a disorganized, chaotic crowd.
That is a great way to picture it. And heat does the same thing.
Applying intense heat achieves the exact same result just through thermal agitation. As the temperature of the metal rises, its atoms begin to vibrate.
And I guess if it gets hot enough, the vibrations just overwhelm the atomic bonds.
Exactly. The bonds holding the domains in their strict north-south orientation just break down. The internal structure shakes itself apart, the domains scatter, and the unified magnetic field just fades away.
Wow. So the magnetic force isn't a physical substance. It's entirely an emergent property of organization.
Right. It's all about how the atoms are arranged.
And if we take that localized organization and scale it up to the size of a planet, we arrive at the Earth itself, which is the grandest example in the text.
Yes, the Earth is a giant magnet. A suspended magnet always points north-south because it's trapped inside the massive magnetic field generated by the Earth.
But like we said at the start, Earth's geographic North Pole is actually its magnetic South Pole.
It's a great little twist. But remember, that field extends far beyond the physical surface of the globe. Magnets project invisible spheres of influence into the space around them.
Right, from physical objects to the invisible fields they create. And to understand how these forces interact without physically touching, you have to kind of map the field.
Yeah, and the textbook has this great illustration. You place a piece of glass over a bar magnet and sprinkle iron filings, just tiny shavings of iron over the glass.
And if you tap that glass gently, the filings don't just pile up randomly. They physically draw the invisible lines of force,
They really do. They form these sweeping, symmetrical arcs.
traveling from north to south on the outside and south to north on the inside.
Exactly. The lines emerge from the North Pole, travel through the empty space outside the material, and re-enter at the South Pole. Then they complete the loop internally.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
I was thinking about my kitchen fridge while visualizing those iron filings.
Oh, okay. Where are you going with this?
Well, if I take a souvenir magnet and it aggressively snaps onto the metal door of my fridge, does that mean the fridge itself is generating a magnetic field? Is my fridge a magnet?
It is a logical assumption, but an incorrect one. Your refrigerator door is not a magnet.
But it sticks.
Right, because it's made of steel, which contains iron, a magnetic material, but it lacks that permanent internal atomic alignment we discussed earlier.
Oh, so it doesn't have the organized domains.
Exactly. This brings up a critical rule from the text for identifying true magnets. Repulsion is the only sure test of magnetism.
Wait, really? So attraction can actually be deceptive?
Highly deceptive. A permanent magnet will attract another magnet's opposite pole, but it will also attract a completely unmagnetized piece of iron.
Oh, I see. So when my souvenir magnet approaches the fridge, its strong external field kind of reaches into the unmagnetized steel.
Yes, and it temporarily forces the random atomic domains in the door to align. It induces a temporary opposite pole in the steel.
That causes the attraction. But the moment I pull the magnet away,
The atoms in the fridge door return to their chaotic, unmagnetized state. So to prove you have two permanent magnets, you have to force their poles together, north to north or south to south.
and if you attempt that, you actually feel a physical barrier of empty space resisting you.
Yeah, the two fields will aggressively push back against your hands. If you repeat the iron filing visualization with two north poles facing each other, they don't form connecting arcs.
They form like a tense, empty boundary line down the middle, right?
Exactly. The lines of force physically clash and bend sharply away from one another.
And that fundamental behavior like repelling and opposites attracting is not isolated to permanent magnets. It's the exact same invisible bands that brings us to the next massive concept in the textbook.
Electricity. They're deeply unified forces.
Right. To see that connection, we shift from the rigid, permanent alignment of atoms to the violent movement of the particles that make up those atoms. We enter the realm of static electricity.
This brings us to the classic foundational experiments in the text. Taking a hard ebony rod and rubbing it vigorously with cat skin. Or rubbing a glass rod with silk.
By introducing that mechanical friction, the objects become charged. The ebony rod gets a negative charge, and the glass rod becomes positive. But why?
Well, the friction is doing physical work at the subatomic level. Every atom has a heavy, dense nucleus of positively charged protons, surrounded by a cloud of negatively charged electrons.
I always picture the electrons as these restless partygoers,
Oh,
because they are incredibly light, and on the outer edge, they are highly mobile.
that's a great way to look at it.
If you introduce energy, like the friction of rubbing, they are perfectly willing to jump ship and move to a new material, while the heavy protons just stay home.
That mobility is the key. When you rub the ebony rod against the cat skin, the physical friction provides enough energy to tear loosely held electrons away from the skin.
And they physically transfer onto the ebony rod.
Right. Because the rod now has a surplus of electrons, it exhibits a net negative charge. And the cat skin, having lost its negative electrons, is left with a net positive charge.
And the rules of attraction immediately apply. Two negatively charged ebony rods will aggressively repel each other, while a negative ebony rod and a positive glass rod will pull together.
What's fascinating here is how these micro movements of invisible electrons scale up to generate massive natural phenomena.
Like what?
Well, the exact same mechanism occurring between the cat skin and the rod is responsible for lightning.
Oh, wow. So a storm cloud is basically functioning as a massive friction engine.
Precisely. Inside a cumulonimbus cloud, violent thermal updrafts and downdrafts are constantly churning. Millions of microscopic ice crystals and water droplets are colliding at high speeds.
So that massive scale of friction is stripping electrons from the rising ice crystals.
Yes, and it carries them to the lower portion of the cloud. You end up with an enormous pool of negative charge at the bottom and a highly positive charge at the top or on the Earth below.
And nature aggressively seeks equilibrium. It cannot sustain that level of energetic imbalance.
Exactly. When the electrical tension overwhelms the insulating properties of the air, the surplus electrons violently tear a conductive channel through the atmosphere to reunite with the positive protons.
And that instantaneous rush of billions of electrons is the massive static spark we call lightning. That is wild.
It really is. Now, to detect these charges without, waiting for a lightning strike, the textbook mentions the gold leaf electroscope.
Right, which operates purely on the principle of repulsion. It's a glass jar housing a central brass rod. And at the bottom, hanging freely, are two incredibly thin pieces of gold foil.
Yeah. If you touch a charged object at the top of the metal rod, those surplus electrons flow down the brass and flood into both pieces of gold foil.
And because both leaves of foil are now saturated with the exact same negative charge, they instantly repel one another. They physically push apart and hover in the air.
It provides a highly sensitive visual gauge of that invisible electrical tension.
But static electricity, by definition, is stationary. It just builds up and sits there until it explosively discharges.
Right, like a lightning bolt. Immense energy, but instantaneous and entirely unpredictable.
So to actually power our homes and gadgets, we have to tame those restless electrons. We have to transform an explosive spark into a steady, controlled flow. We need a current.
Exactly. And generating a steady current requires a continuous chemical engine.
Which historically began with the voltaic cell, right?
Yes, submerging a copper plate and a zinc plate into a bath of dilute sulfuric acid. The acid forces a continuous chemical reaction that strips electrons from one plate and pushes them toward the other.
But I'm guessing liquid acid baths are highly impractical for, say, powering a TV remote.
Very impractical.
Yeah.
Which necessitated the engineering of the dry cell battery.
Right. A standard 1.5-volt battery is essentially a miniature chemical sandwich, a self-contained pressure vessel. The text breaks down its anatomy beautifully.
It does. The outer casing is made of zinc, which serves as the negative terminal. Running straight down the center of that casing is a solid rod of carbon, which acts as the positive terminal.
And what's in between them?
To facilitate the reaction without sloshing liquids, the space between the zinc and the carbon is packed with a thick electrolytic paste.
A mixture of ammonium chloride, manganese dioxide, and carbon powder, if I recall.
That's the one. This chemical paste acts as an engine. It aggressively strips electrons from the atoms in the paste and forces them to accumulate on the inner wall of the zinc casing.
So the zinc becomes highly pressurized with surplus electrons, and they are all desperately trying to reach the positive carbon rod in the center.
But the dense chemical paste actually blocks them from traveling directly across the interior of the battery. They are trapped.
Holding their potential energy until you provide an external pathway.
Exactly. The moment you place that battery into a device and close the circuit, you provide a road for those electrons.
They race out of the negative zinc casing, travel through the circuitry of the device, and return into the positive carbon rod, balancing the chemical tension. But how do we get that power out of the battery safely?
Well, to build those external pathways safely, we have to strictly organize our materials into conductors and insulators. It all comes down to atomic structure.
Right. Conductors, like copper and silver, have atomic structures where the outermost electrons are held very loosely.
Yes. When the chemical pressure of the battery is applied to a copper wire, those loose electrons easily detach and bump into their neighbors. They pass the electrical charge down the line, almost like a high-speed bucket brigade.
And insulators operate on the exact opposite principle.
Right. Materials like rubber, glass, and plastic have outer electrons that are locked down incredibly tight. They require an immense amount of force to break free.
So by wrapping a highly conductive copper wire in an insulating layer of rubber, you keep the electricity safely on the road. The electrons race down the copper but bounce harmlessly off the rubber guardrails.
Exactly, which allows us to safely handle live cables. And when engineering these cables, the specific wire gauges mentioned in the text become really interesting.
Like the 3.029 or 7.036 cables. I always wondered what those numbers meant.
It's highly practical nomenclature. The first digit tells you exactly how many strands of wire are inside the insulation. The subsequent number details the diameter of each strand.
So a 3.029 cable contains 3 distinct strands, each measuring 0.029 inches thick. That is a neat little aha moment for my next trip to the hardware store.
It really is. And bundling multiple thin strands together creates a cable that is far more flexible than a single, thick, solid rod of copper.
Which is vital when pulling wiring through walls. Now, the text also contrasts the DC power from batteries with AC power, right?
Yes. Household electricity runs on alternating current, or AC. The electropressure constantly reverses direction, pushing and pulling the electrons back and forth 50 times every single second.
That is incredibly fast. But we've generated the electricity and given it a safe path to travel. What actually happens when it reaches its destination? What can this flowing river of electrons actually do to matter?
The textbook outlines 5 specific physical effects of electrical current.
So what does this all mean mechanically? Let's trace these 5 effects. The first is heating.
Right. When you force an electrical current through a material that actively resists the flow, like the nichrome wire inside an iron or a space heater, the electrons don't flow smoothly.
They crash into the atoms of the wire.
Constantly.
Yeah.
That subatomic friction generates immense amounts of thermal energy. The electrical flow is physically converted into radiant heat.
Okay, that makes sense. The second is lighting, which is kind of an extreme escalation of the heating effect, right?
Exactly. If you force that current through an incredibly thin, highly resistant tungsten filament inside a glass bulb, the subatomic friction becomes so intense that the metal gets hot enough to glow.
It reaches incandescence, emitting visible light.
Yes. The third effect is chemical. A sustained electrical current can act as a physical wedge to alter molecular bonds, like electroplating or splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen.
By physically tearing the H2O molecules apart with the flow of electrons?
Yes.
Wow. Now, the fourth one is the physiological effect, which I have to admit I have a somewhat morbid fascination with.
It's definitely the most visceral. The human nervous system operates via microscopic electrical impulses from the brain to our muscles.
So if a person makes physical contact with a live power source, that massive external current literally overrides the body's own electrical signals, doesn't it?
It does. It entirely overrides those delicate signals and forces the muscles to violently and involuntarily contract. The person loses all mechanical control, which is why an electric shock is so dangerous.
It's terrifying, really. But the fifth and final property, this is where it all comes together, the magnetic effect.
Yes, if we connect this to the bigger picture, this effect reveals the beautiful full-circle symmetry of the textbook. If you run an electrical current through a plain copper wire and place a compass near it, the compass needle will sharply deflect.
Wait, so the flowing river of electrons physically generates a magnetic field around the wire.
You cannot have flowing electricity without simultaneously generating magnetism. Moving electrical charges actively bend the space around them to create magnetic fields.
That is just mind-blowing. We started with rocks that pull iron, moved to moving electrons, and now realize that moving electrons actually create magnetism.
It's the foundation for electric motors, generators, and the entire global power grid. The permanent force locked inside the ancient rock and the volatile current flowing through modern cables are simply 2 expressions of the exact same unified system.
It really brings our understanding into perfect symmetry. I mean, just to recap our journey here. We started with ancient magnesium lodestones. We learned the sure test of repulsion. We tracked those restless electrons from cat skins all the way to massive lightning strikes.
We built chemical batteries, explored circuits, and finally saw how electricity heats, lights, and magnetizes our world.
So, for you listening, keep that structural symmetry in mind. The next time you flip a light switch, or put a 1.5-volt battery in a remote, or just look at a power cable, recognize that you are holding the end result of these massive, invisible natural forces acting in perfect harmony.
You are watching highly tensed electrons fighting to achieve equilibrium.
Exactly. But before we end this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final puzzle to ponder. A mechanical paradox built on the rules we just mapped out.
Oh, this is a good one.
Right, so fact 1. The textbook says a compass needle proves the Earth is a massive, functioning magnet. Fact 2. Extreme thermal energy violently shakes atomic domains apart, destroying a material's magnetism.
Which we discussed earlier with heating a permanent magnet.
Exactly, but wait. Isn't the deep interior of our planet filled with boiling hot molten rock? Temperatures that instantly obliterate permanent magnetism.
Yes, the core is incredibly hot.
So if the center of our giant magnet is a boiling liquid, how does the Earth generate a magnetic field at all? How does it survive its own internal heat? I highly encourage you to investigate the mechanics of dynamo theory on your own to explore the answer. It is a puzzle well worth your time. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.